Welcome to the deep dive. We're cracking open a stack of your sources today. Articles, some research, notes, taking a real deep dive into something pretty interesting. Leadership patterns in the early church.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. And by really, digging into it, we can hopefully get a clearer picture of how things actually worked back then. Might challenge a few assumptions along the way.
That's exactly it. So our mission really is to sift through these sources together, try and figure out what leadership looked like in the New Testament era, what's surprising maybe compared to now, and what useful lessons we can actually pull out for today. We've got some really compelling material here focusing on how leadership function. I'm quite excited to explore this.
Me too. I'm looking forward to getting into the details and seeing how they connect to the bigger picture the sources paint.
Okay, great. So let's just jump right in then. What did the sources tell us about the very first leadership patterns, the initial ones? Was it like structured, like churches we might recognize today?
Well, what the material makes clear pretty much right away is how fluid things were. There wasn't just one single rigid blueprint laid out for everyone. The idea, for instance, of one specific minister or, say, a priest in charge, that's just not really there, not emphasized. And even for things like baptizing or leading the Lord's Supper, ordination wasn't presented as some kind of universal requirement.
Okay, right. So maybe less formal than we often picture.
Oh, much less formal, yeah. The sources really underscore the informality, which makes sense, right? When you think about them meeting in homes, often small groups, maybe 10, 25 people. In that kind of setting, it naturally encouraged participation from, well, pretty much everyone. Almost like an extended family gathering, often centered around meals, conversation. Think about that dynamic compared to, a big formal assembly.
Yeah, that paints a very different picture. Makes a lot of sense. So, okay, informal, but there was definitely leadership happening. What was the core principle? What was guiding it? The model.
This is where the material points to something really, really foundational. It points directly to Jesus' own model, what the sources describe as costly service for others, or cruciform sacrificial leadership.
Cruciform. So shaped like the cross, like sacrifice.
Exactly that. Jesus washing his disciples' feet. That's held up as this profound visual example. It's not about asserting authority, or gaining status, preeminence. Christian leadership, based on these sources drawing from Jesus and Paul, it's fundamentally about humble, often costly, sacrificial service to others. Paul modeled this all the time. It was just central to how he saw leadership working.
Right, and that's where it gets really interesting, isn't it? It just completely flips the script on, well, typical power dynamics. It's service, not status.
Precisely. It's a revolutionary kind of authority, really, derived from self-giving love.
Speaking of revolutionary, the sources spend quite a bit of time on Jesus's approach to women. What stands out there?
The material actually calls Jesus' view of women breathtakingly revolutionary for his culture for that time. He consistently treated them with this remarkable dignity and respect, not as subordinates, as equals. Think about some of the examples they mention. He chose to reveal his messiahship first to the Samaritan woman at the well, effectively equipping her, right?
Yeah.
To be the first evangelist to her whole community.
Wow, yeah.
And he called women to be his disciples. Some even traveled with him in the 12. Which was highly, highly unusual then.
And those interactions that just broke all the norms.
Constantly, yeah. Blessing the woman with the bleeding issue, acknowledging her faith publicly, touching the dead girl, bringing her back, accepting the costly worship from the prostitute, commending the faith of the Syrophoenician woman. And remember Mary, Martha and Lazarus' sister.
Sitting at his feet, choosing the better part.
Yes, exactly. She deliberately took the role that, well, men typically occupied in that culture, sitting, learning from a rabbi. And Jesus explicitly defended her choice when Martha complained. Then later, that last week, when Mary anointed him with that expensive perfume, he defended her again, said her act would be remembered wherever the gospel is preached. And women, they followed him to the cross. They were there at his death, his burial, when most of the male disciples had, well, scattered.
And the point the sources make about Resurrection Sunday, it's just incredible.
It really is. Jesus chose to appear first to women, gave the pivotal message he's risen, and sent them to tell the male apostles. One source even quotes Thomas Aquinas calling these women apostles to the 12 apostles.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's also noted that Luke, in his gospel, he makes this point of pairing men and women 34 times to show these stand together side by side, equals in Jesus' movement.
So intentional inclusivity, it sounds like it is absolutely central to his ministry.
That's the argument the sources make, yes. They point back to the creation ideal in Genesis 1 and 2, suggesting Jesus was highlighting this fundamental truth of equality. No hint of inherent female subordination or, male headship being the original design. It's observed, too, that ordination, as we might think of it today, that wasn't really the focus for Jesus or Paul regarding leadership. It was more about calling, gifting, which is, a key point for denominations wrestling with these things today.
That sets the stage really well. Okay, so moving into Paul's time, the church is spreading. How did leadership evolve then? Did it change much?
The sources show it was still very much a picture of flexibility.
Yeah.
And diversity. There still wasn't one single mandated structure for everybody. It seems to have been driven by, functionality, what worked, and crucially, that same core principle, sacrificial service, adapting as circumstances changed. The movement basically had kind of two main organizational expressions, the local house churches and then the church planting teams. And if you look at the types of leaders the material mentions, you see this dynamic play out. You had apostles leading those planting teams. That included the original 12, obviously, but also this expanded unnamed group who were pioneering new works. Paul talks about apostles as the church's foundation, with Christ as the cornerstone. While the whole community was involved, this specific apostolic role seems key for, starting things, breaking new ground.
And I remember that detail about a woman apostle. That's quite something.
Yes, it's right there in the text. Paul commends a woman named Junia, explicitly calls her outstanding among the apostles.
Right.
Then you had a whole host of other co-workers involved in ministry, many mentioned right alongside Paul. He writes about Euodia and Syntyche, two women who struggled side by side with him planting the church in Philippi. The material really emphasizes Paul's view that both men and women receive spiritual gifts. And we're expected to use them for shared ministry. You see that in 1 Corinthians 12.
Okay.
Prophets were another important group, these charismatic leaders. And importantly, the sources point out, women served in this role too. Philip the evangelist, remember, had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. That's specifically noted in Acts. Then, absolutely central to the everyday life of the church were the house church leaders. Like we said, structures were flexible. Leaders just naturally emerged in the context of these home gatherings. And what's really significant is that many of these leaders were women.
Right, because the home was kind of their domain, wasn't it, in that culture?
Exactly. In the Roman world, the oikos, the household, that was primarily the woman's sphere of responsibility. They managed staff, finances, the daily life of the home. So it's completely natural for women to participate fully in churches meeting right there in their own homes.
Can you give us some examples the sources mentioned?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The material lists churches meeting in the homes of Lydia, Nympha, possibly Chloe, and Phoebe too. And the couple Priscilla and Aquila, they're mentioned multiple times having churches in their homes in Rome, maybe Corinth, Ephesus. They even famously took Apollos aside, didn't they? And explained the way of God more adequately to him.
Right. Were there male house church leaders mentioned too?
Oh, definitely, yes. The sources list plenty of men, some even quite new believers like the jailer in Philippi, Jason in Thessalonica, Titius Justus and Crispus in Corinth, Archippus and Philon in Colossae.
Yeah.
Paul wasn't imposing a system from above. He was recognizing, encouraging the natural leadership bubbling up from these households. And here's a really critical point the sources make. This whole picture, it shifts significantly after Emperor Constantine, when church buildings started going up. As gatherings moved from private homes into public spaces, leadership gradually transitioned towards ordained men. And women were slowly excluded from roles like leading services, teaching, baptizing, presiding at the Lord's Supper. That's a major shift noted in the material.
Interesting. Okay, what else? Any other types of leaders?
Yes. Finally, you had area oversight leaders. As the number of house churches grew in a town or city, there was a need for leaders to provide some oversight across the different groups. Paul tells Titus to appoint these elders in every town. Now, while often these were older, respected men, the sources indicate this role also included women. They suggest Priscilla and Aquila might have served in this kind of oversight capacity on top of leading their house church. They even risked their lives for the wider Gentile churches. And Phoebe is mentioned again here, called a servant or minister diakonos, and a leader or patron prostatus in Cenchrea, potentially indicating an oversight role there too.
So these elders weren't necessarily the leader of one specific house church, but more overseeing multiple groups.
That seems to be the idea, yes, providing cohesion across the multiplying house churches in a particular place. And the material really stresses that both men and women served in all these various capacities: apostle, prophet, house church leader, area oversight leader. Roger Gehring's estimate mentioned in the sources that maybe a quarter of Paul's co-workers were women. That was really something for the time.
Okay, so putting it all together,
Yeah.
it wasn't about finding the one right system for leadership, was it? It was more about principles.
Exactly. Flexibility, functionality, adapting to circumstances to help the movement multiply. That seems key. But, and this is crucial, the sources are absolutely clear, the principle of leaders sacrificing for others, modeling Jesus's servant leadership.
Yeah.
That was non-negotiable. Jesus was so explicit about this, wasn't he? Contrasting his model sharply with Gentile rulers who lorded over people. He said, not so with you.
Right.
So this picture of dynamic, multiplying movements, the sources argue they're marked by these functional, flexible structures, and critically, by inclusive, self-sacrificing, other-centered, humble servant leadership from everyone involved, men and women.
That is powerful stuff. Okay, so bringing this home, what does all this detailed look at the early church mean for us today? Especially maybe for denominations or groups facing challenges like stagnation or plateauing?
Well, the compelling point the sources really seem to drive home is this. For movements to be revitalized today, there's a need to fully utilize every single valuable resource, all the spirit-gifted leaders, both women and men. The flexibility we see in the New Testament suggests we have freedom, freedom to adapt our structures today. But that core principle of sacrificial service and the historical example of radical inclusivity, they're presented as essential lessons, things we might have perhaps lost sight of.
So looking back at how they operated, apostles pioneering, prophets giving insight, house church leaders nurturing disciples, area leaders providing oversight, these are maybe models of function that can inform how we organize today, rather than rigid rules we have to copy exactly.
Precisely. That's a great way to put it. The sources really challenge us, don't they, to consider how those different functions could be expressed now in our contexts, and critically, how re-embracing that original inclusivity, the full mobilization of all gifts, alongside a deep, genuine commitment to sacrificial service, how that could potentially unleash potential, really revitalize people and communities. The potential role of house churches today is also raised explicitly in the material. That's something worth serious thought for revitalization.
Wow, okay. This deep dive into the sources really paints a picture, doesn't it? Early church leadership.
Yeah.
Maybe less institutional, more organic, more dynamic than we might have assumed, built on this incredible foundation of sacrificial service, and strikingly, seems to have been far more inclusive of women in significant leadership roles than, well, later periods became.
The sources draw that direct line, yeah, between the flexibility, the functionality, the inclusivity, and especially that sacrificial servant leadership. And the fact that it was a rapidly multiplying movement, they definitely present this as a challenge to us today. How are we structuring? How are we leading? Are we holding on to those core principles?
It certainly gives you a lot to think about.
It really does, yeah.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now?
Well, when you consider that the sources state pretty clearly that in the early church, both women and men served as apostles, prophets, local house church leaders, and area oversight leaders, and that this full inclusive use of gifts, hand in hand with a deep commitment to selfless sacrificial service, was apparently key to their dynamic movement.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How might fully embracing that kind of radical inclusion and that kind of costly service, how might that fundamentally impact revitalization efforts and just the general health of movements today?
Exactly. It's a deeply provocative thought, isn't it?
Right.
Something to really mull over.